With Brant getting his third banner, it feels like this character is being shoved down our throats. But let's discuss if this is for good reason or not. In this video, I'm going to be talking about Brant's biggest pros and cons, so you can decide whether you want to pull for him or not. Starting with the fact that this character has a ridiculous amount of teams that he can work in. And when I say that Brant's team selection is absolutely ridiculous, what I actually mean to say is that out of all sub-DPS characters in the entire game, except for Thundah, Brant has the highest amount of teams in the entire game. Obviously, there is the Triple Fusion team. I don't think I really need to elaborate much on why he's good in the Triple Fusion team. But in case I do, he just kinda has literally perfect synergy with Lupa and Chong-Li, because, well, that's the point of the entire team. Lupa buffs Brant an absolutely enormous amount, which leads to Brant doing an absolute ridiculous amount of damage. And then Brant also passes off a team buff towards Chong-Li, which creates this vicious cycle of just never letting the enemy get a break, because you're always doing good damage. But aside from the Triple Fusion team, Brant has a very wide selection of other teammates up his sleeve. Obviously, like I said, there's the Chong-Li-Lupa combo, but Brant is also one of the best buffers for Encore, who to this day is still a pretty good DPS. Encore is obviously a fusion character, and while she does do primarily basic attack damage, she also has a pretty good amount of skill damage, meaning that Brant's Ultra skill is pretty useful for Encore as a character. Combine this with his large damage output, and it makes Brant one of Encore's best partners. Look at Chixia as well. Chixia is not as good of a character as Encore is, but her damage output is still pretty respectable, especially considering the fact that Chixia actually is a perfect character to use Brant's Ultra skill on, because she is yet again a fusion character, and she has a much higher amount of skill damage than Encore does. But if you thought it ended with the fusion characters, oh, you would be wrong. Because of Brant's massive personal damage, assuming you have his signature weapon, Brant also becomes an incredible slot-in for almost every single skill-based main DPS. Obviously, I've already talked about Chong-Li. I feel like I've said that name a lot, and trust me, I'm not going to stop anytime soon. But Brant is also one of the best in-slot characters when running with Jinshi. His aerial combat synergizes perfectly with Jinshi, and while he may not have any coordinated attacks, Verena is still a character within the video game, so it's not like you need them. Then there's Carlotta, and he doesn't really have any specific synergies with Carlotta, except that he's able to buff her skill damage and just does a ridiculous amount of damage himself. And outside of Carlotta, there's also Frolova, who does primarily skill damage on the field. And while he is not exactly a best-in-slot character with Frolova, he's not even a top 3 character to be honest, he's still a pretty good option. And if the sheer amount of teammates he was able to buff wasn't enough to sell you on this character being goated, just look at the second point, which is the fact that he is one of the very few sub-DPS characters who is actually able to play as a hypercarry. Now, I'm not gonna hype up this point too much. His hypercarry teams, while they are good, are not exactly what I would call top-notch. But if you're at the early stages of making an account for the game, Brant is actually a pretty good long-term investment. The issue that I have with most sub-DPS characters is the fact that their relevance is entirely based upon how much relevance is put on their main DPS. For example, Zhezhi is gonna start losing steam the second Carlotta does. But Brant still has his main DPS teams, and he doesn't literally need Chong-Li in order to have a reason to exist on your account. So if you do not have any of the DPSs that Brant works with, but you still want to pull for Brant, it's completely fine to just pull him and main DPS him. I have plenty of friends who do this, and it can still clear tower pretty comfortably. For a main DPS Brant, you'd want to do a double anchor rotation, where you build up a ton of Forte beforehand, and then you go into Thundah, you use your Ultra skill on Brant, use his first anchor, and then you can start building up his second anchor. You get 2 nuclear bombs out of this, and while it's an incredibly long rotation, you're also gonna get a pretty good amount of damage per rotation in order to compensate. So, he's a sub-DPS, he's a main DPS, surely he can't be a healer too, right? Well, do I got news for you, buddy, because Brant is also a healer and a shielder on top of this as well. Shields are incredibly rare to see in the game, considering we only have them on like some sequences and like Taucha, which, well, that's not exactly a lot, is it? So Brant having both healing and shielding means that he'll be good for any sort of content that wants you to heal or shield, whether it be through buffing your damage if you have healing and shielding, or if it's just straight up the enemy wants you dead. But this is a bit of a potential main argument, because we do not have much content that currently encourages you to specifically have healing and shielding. But if it ever does come out, Brant has it. And as if that was not enough to sell you on this character, Brant has some of the highest personal damage out of all sub-DPS characters. Actually, no, scratch that. At this current point in time, it is the highest, and he doesn't even need a Lupa to do it. Obviously, it's a bit of a cop-out answer to say that, ooh, Brant does more damage than Yinlin if you give Yinlin Shorekeeper, but Brant gets Lupa. But Brant doesn't even need the Lupa in order to beat every other sub-DPS in terms of damage output. Now, while he does kind of sacrifice some utility in order to do this damage, since his best in slot sit is Tidebreaking Courage instead of something like Moonlit Clouds, it is still undeniable that Brant's personal damage is higher than every other sub-DPS in the entire game. His damage is so high, in fact, that, like I said earlier, running a damage-based set on your Brant is going to be better than simply buffing your main DPS. And if we start giving him the Mono Fusion team with Lupa, he's just gonna start leaving everyone in the dust in terms of damage output. Obviously, his damage output isn't going to be touching characters like Jinchi if you're playing him in the sub-DPS role, but he definitely does have the highest damage output out of every single sub-DPS character. So now that I've glazed Brant for the last 6 minutes, maybe it's time to talk about some of the things he doesn't really do that well. And the big thing that I have to point to is that, man, am I glad this character does not use a gun, because if he did, he wouldn't be hitting anything. This man's aim is horrid, and if you're trying to play him in Whimpering Wastes, you will feel it, because there's a pretty good chance that enemies are, non-existent after Lupa is done with them. Brant is incredibly likely to start missing his attacks. And when you miss his attacks, you're not generating any Forte. And if you're not generating any Forte, you are wasting time. Especially if you simply can't hit your intro skill, because if you miss your intro skill, you have to start all the way from his first mid-air attack, which is incredibly slow compared to the second and third one. So honestly, simply missing your intro skill can be quite a big bummer. But hey, it's not a deal breaker, is it? Well, what if I told you about the fact that there are plenty of times where he will simply just miss his greatest damage tool, which is his massive anchor drop. This is not at all a rare sight to see, especially in game modes like Whimpering Wastes, where there's a pretty good chance that the enemy is simply dead before it even lands. And if you can't get the final hit of the anchor, you are not getting most of the Concerto energy. And considering the fact that you're not getting most of the Concerto energy, well, that means your Brant rotation is simply way longer than it needs to be. So ultimately, this character has quite a couple of usability issues that can make him pretty annoying to pilot. But overall, I wouldn't exactly consider them deal breakers, considering just how many things Brant does correctly. And then for the only other negative I really have about him, is this character is a nightmare to build. Brant has some of the strictest stat requirements in the entire game, because unlike other characters, you can't just run this man on damage bonus, attack, attack. No, he decided he wanted to get a little silly with it and decided to go for an even rarer main stat, which is energy regen. Brant gains an absolutely bonkers amount of attack the more energy regen you build it on him, up to a maximum of 280% energy regen. This is something you could have guessed from the Tidebreaking Courage set, considering you need 250% energy regen in order to proc the 30% damage bonus. And while 280% energy regen is not absolutely required in order to play Brant, if you want to use Tidebreaking Courage, you're gonna want to reach at least 250%. And fun fact, you need an ER weapon to do this. And another fun fact, this is actually a suboptimal way to build Brant, assuming you don't have his signature. But having his signature weapon also gives its own problems. So let's start going by them one by one. If you're running a non-ER weapon, you have to build Molten Rift instead of Tidebreaking Courage. You're simply not going to reach the required amount of ER if you don't have an ER weapon. Then if you have Sword of Voyager, or the Overture, you're going to need to go for double ER main stat and at least a couple of substats. And then his signature weapon is a bit unique. You don't need any ER substats in order to reach the 250 threshold. But if you go for double ER and you have the ER main stats, you're very quickly going to start overcapping, in which case you're gonna need to build ER Fusion. But guess what? If you're building ER Fusion, you're going to need several substats again, which means that Brant's main stats are essentially a puzzle. If you have too much energy regen, well, time to farm for a different main stat, and if you don't have enough energy regen, honestly your substats just are kinda mid at that point. And all of this crescendos to the fact that if you do not have Brant's signature weapon, you lose a ridiculous amount of damage. Now, this could be a point all on its own, but I feel like it's simply an extension of his build requirements being this harsh, because you cannot use his best in slot set if you do not have an ER weapon. But that's just my opinion. What do you think of Brant? Let me know in the comments down below. And while you're down there, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. If you have any questions, be sure to check out my Discord, which is linked in the description below. I'm pretty active in there, so there's a pretty good chance I'll answer your question. Additionally, if you just want to see more of me, be sure to check out my second channel, which is also linked in the description. I kinda just upload whatever I want on there, but primarily Punishing Grey Raven content. But that'll be all from me. Peace.